All righty, Rayfield. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Whatever time you are watching this video is a good time. The title of this video is Zero Tolerance. It is an agency for persons with disabilities from the state of Florida training. It is a very, very important training before anyone can work at a facility, volunteer at a facility, or do anything at a facility. Agency for persons with disabilities. It is required to have this training. It is a very important training. I have to tell you, it's interesting. It's long. It's 6 modules, and we're going to go through it module 1 through 6. We're going to take our time and we're going to go over it. And even though in some areas it might be redundant, I adhere to you. I implore you to listen. Because as a person with a disability, we are living lives and we matter. Everybody matters and everybody deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And at Rayfield, we're going to make sure as best we can that that happens. So in our training overview, our first module, we're going to talk about the purpose of having a training like Zero Tolerance. We're going to talk about the objectives that are in the course. We're going to talk about the audience and the length of the training. We're going to talk about the organization, and we're going to talk about the instructional icons, what to look for when we are going through this training. In Module 2, we're going to define abuse, neglect, exploitation of persons with developmental disabilities. We're going to talk about, of course, the module overview, the learning objectives. We're going to talk to you about who is a caregiver, caregiver task, caregiver abuse, the differences in the definition for children and adults. We're going to talk about the types of caregivers, the types of abuse, neglect, and exploitation of caregivers. We're going to do an activity that will give you an indication of some types of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We're going to talk to you about the laws of abuse, the new law regarding sexual misconduct, and we're going to take some excerpts from the Florida law about sexual misconduct and the statutes of the law that are mandated with these statutes, and then we'll have an activity. Module 3, exploring the issues. Module overview, learning objectives, power and control, common sense characteristics, the law, Steinberg and Hilton of 1998, characteristics of abuse, incident studies, and frequency and location of sexual abuse, an activity, and then the Module 3 summary. Module 4, recognizing the signs and symptoms of abuse and neglect. And there's a lot, almost 20 pages in Module 4. The overview all the way down to what you might suspect in recognizing the signs and symptoms. And I won't read them, every one of them, because when we get to that module, we're probably going to have to break it into 2 parts. Module 5, reporting requirements. The overview, the objectives, the abuse and exploitation, the mandatory reporting requirements, the clients and the client-on-client abuse, the entities that must be notified, all the way down to, of course, our activity and our summary. And then finally, Module 6, prevention and safety and planning. We go through the objectives as we've done with all the other modules. We do prevention methods, efforts for providers to implement with their employees for staying safe, additional tips for caregivers, tips and discussions to make things easier, what persons really need to know, how to set boundaries, how to identify appropriate behavior in public and private, teach the children protective behavior, appropriate names for genitals, and self-help help, seeking help when it is needed. At the end of the study, of course, we're going to give you references and resources, and then we have a final assessment. That's right. We receive a certificate for the zero tolerance training, and there will be a final assessment, and you will receive your certificate for participating in this training. So guys, let's get going. Module 1, our training overview. We're going to meet a lady named Kristen, and she has a cognitive disability. I am nonverbal, and I live in a group home. And since I am a resident who has lived here the longest, I have a roommate. One of the house rules is lights out by 10 o'clock. Most other residents are asleep by 10:30. On occasion, one of the staff members comes into my room around 11:30 and forces me to have sex and touches me sexually. He tells me that he chooses me because I am the prettiest and nicest resident, and that I am special, and that he honors me, and that's why he comes in my room. He tells me that he's helping me to experience sexual pleasure, and that I would not experience it without him. However, to not hurt the other residents' feelings, he tells me not to tell anyone. And if I do, he says that he'll deny it. And then he'll come in the middle of the night and he'll hurt me. What ways makes me feel that I should thank him? He tells me I should thank him, but I cannot figure out why I do not feel good about this situation. I wait in fear every single night in the dark. Next resident, I am Sheila. I have cerebral palsy, and I have some movement in my arms, but I cannot speak. My mother helps me get dressed every day. However, when she helps me out of bed in the morning, she pulls me by my arms with extreme force. She bathes me in very hot water and washes my hair with her nails to a point that it brings me to tears, with tears streaming down my face every single day. She also lets the shampoo run into my eyes, and meantime she helps me to eat. But she feeds me like cold food and apricot baby food every meal. She never really pays attention and stuffs the food in my mouth so hard that it hurts my throat to swallow, sometimes causing me to cough and choke. My mom scares me, and I do not know what to do or what to say or who to tell because she is my mom. My name is Sheila. The first girl's name was Christian. Purpose of our training. The purpose of the Zero Tolerance Training course is to teach direct care providers, support coordinators, and any person providing support to an APD client about abuse, neglect, exploitation of persons with developmental disabilities. It will provide information on how often these types of crimes happen and describe how and why these crimes usually occur. This training will provide you with the tools to identify potentially dangerous situations and tell you how to report that information. Finally, this course will provide you information about things you can do to help prevent abuse, neglect, and exploitation from happening in the first place. Our course objectives. At the end of this training, you will be able to define a caregiver, define the 5 general types of caregiver abuse, describe the reasons why people with developmental disabilities are more likely to be abused, neglected, and exploited, explain how power and control contribute to caregiver abuse, List statistics related to the abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with developmental disabilities. List who should report abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Describe strategies to apply when assessing a person for abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Explain issues to consider when assessing a person for abuse, neglect, and exploitation. List indicators of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Explain how to report abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Explain procedures for investigating abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Describe methods that can be used to prevent abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Describe how to create and maintain a safe living environment for people with developmental disabilities. Our audience, the zero tolerance, is intended for direct caregivers and waiver support coordinators. The estimate time of completion of this course is 4 hours. So we will be doing this training throughout the rest of the month and getting all 4 of our training hours in. I already went over the modules with you. There are 6 modules that we will be covering. Okay, so let's take a few minutes and think about it. Who is a caregiver? What does the word caregiver mean? Let's think about it. Who's a caregiver? Maybe a person that helps you get dressed. Maybe a person that helps you put on your clothes. Maybe a person that helps you put on your shoes. Maybe a person that walks with you in the park or fixes your meals or helps you clean the kitchen. What are some personal care tasks that a caregiver might provide? Same thing, helping with meals, helping get dressed, a walk in the park, helping you purchase things at a store. Caregivers might be paid for personal assistance, or they might be people who provide with no pay. Unpaid caregivers might be family members, such as a parent, spouse, sibling, or child, a close friend, a volunteer, or maybe even a neighbor. Still, others who might be paid are involved in an individual's care may include a support coordinator, a homemaker, a driver, a doctor, a nurse, a teacher, a social worker, a psychiatrist, a therapist, a counselor, a job coach, a sign language interpreter, workers in a hospital or other institutions, or a companion service provider. What are tasks of caregivers? Bathing, dressing, toileting, eating, cooking, cleaning, running errands, paying bills, providing transportation, transferring, helping a person move from one place to the other, for example, such as a couch or a chair. Caregiver abuse, in definition for children and adults. Florida law defines a caregiver in 2 different ways. One definition applies to caregivers of adults with developmental disabilities who are referred to as vulnerable adults in Florida law. The other definition of caregiver applies to those who are responsible for caregiving children. Okay, definition for children. Caregiver means the parent, the legal custodian, the adult household member, or the other person responsible for a child's welfare is defined as caregiver for children. Other persons for a child's welfare include the child's legal guardian, legal custodian, foster parent, an employee of a private school, public school, daycare center, residential home, institution, facility, or agency, a law enforcement officer employed in a facility, a service or program children operated or contracted by the Department of Juvenile Justice or any other person legally responsible for the child's welfare in residential settings. And also it includes an adult sitter or relative entrusted with the child's care. For the purpose of departmental investigation jurisdiction, this definition does not include the following people when acting as an official: law enforcement officer, except for otherwise provided, employees of municipal or county definition facilities, or employees of the Department of Corrections. Okay, caregiver abuse definition. What is an adult? For adults with developmental disabilities, the Florida Statute 415.1024 states, caregiver means a person who has been entrusted or has assumed the responsibility for frequent and regular care of services to vulnerable adults on a temporary or permanent basis who are committed and who have an agreement or understanding with that person for that person's guardian and caregiver role. Caregiver includes, but it is not limited to, relatives, household member, guardian, neighbor, employee, volunteer. Facility is defined in this subsection for the purpose of departmental investigation jurisdiction. The term caregiver does not include law enforcement officer, employees of municipal, county, or facilities, or the Department of Corrections. Types of caregiver abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Types of caregiver abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Caregiver abuse is the exertion of the caregiver's will over the person's will with a disability. Caregiver abuse usually falls into one of 5 categories. When abuse is present, these categories of abuse frequently overlap. All right, physical abuse: hitting, pushing, pulling, kicking, biting, and assaulting. Inappropriate handling, overuse of restraints, over-medicating, inappropriate behavior modification, keeping the person awake, forcing the person to eat or take medications or beverages that they don't want to take. That's number 1, physical abuse. Number 2, sexual abuse. Verbal harassment, unwanted sexual touching, forced abortion, sterilization or pregnancy, unwanted display of sexual parts, tricking or manipulating into sexual activity. That's number 2, sexual abuse. Number 3, emotional or verbal abuse. Forced on, impairment, denial of right to make decisions, threats to harm an individual, services, animals, family, or children, humiliation, isolating the person from family and friends, emotional neglect, and name calling. Financial exploitation. Number 4, denial of access to control my own funds, misusing financial resources, or stealing money from the person that it belongs to. Number 4, financial exploitation. Neglect, denial of food, clothing, shelter, transportation, not working assigned hours or performing duties, mistreating, refusing to feed, withholding medication, food, medically necessary treatment, assistant, equipment, personal medical care, leaving individuals alone without a way to call for help, leaving individuals in bed all day or not getting them dressed, leaving individuals on the toilet or soiled in their undergarments for long periods of time. Okay, now we have an activity. Identify types of abuse, neglect, or exploitation from physical, sexual, emotional, financial, or neglect. Self-neglected. I want you to think about that. The law regarding types of abuse. Not only is Florida statute separated into types of abuse, but it further categorizes it to distinguish between issues such as abandonment, abuse, neglect of children, and exploitation, abuse, neglect of adults, and with developmental disabilities. Child abandonment. Abandonment means a situation in which the parent or legal guardian of the child is absent from the child and the custodian. The caregiver is responsible for the child's welfare while being able to make no provision for the child, to support them, or make no means or no effort to communicate with them. Child abuse. Abuse means any willful act treated by a relative, caregiver, house member in which likely to cause significant impairment to a vulnerable adult. Child neglect. Neglect occurs when a child is deprived of or is allowed to be deprived of necessary food, clothing, or shelter, or medical treatment, or a child is permitted to live in an environment when such deprivation is permitted to live, cause the child physical, mental, emotional health to be significantly impaired or in danger. A parent or legal custodian legitimately practicing religious beliefs in accordance with a recognized church or religion organization who thereby does not provide specific medical treatment for a child shall not for any reason be considered a neglected parent, a legal custodian. However, such an exception does not preclude a court from ordering the following services to be provided when the health of the child so requires. Medical assistance from a licensed physician, dentist, optometrist, physician, or qualified health care provider, or treatment by a duly accredited practitioner who relies solely on spiritual means for healing in accordance with the tenets, practices of well-recognized religion or organization. Neglect of a child includes acts of omission. Exploitation with a developmental disability. Exploitation means who stands in a position of trust and confidence with a vulnerable adult and knowingly, deceptively intimidates or obtains or uses or endeavors to obtain or use a vulnerable adult's assets, funds, or property to temporarily or permanently deprive that vulnerable adult of its use, benefit, or possession of their funds, assets, or property for the benefit of some other person other than that vulnerable adult, him or herself. Exploitation might include, but not be limited to, breaches of relationships such as misuse of power of attorney, unauthorized taking of personal assets, misappropriation, misuse, or transfer of money belonging to that person, intentional neglect or failure to effectively use the vulnerable adult's income and assets for the necessities required for that person. Abuse of a developmentally disabled person, willfully, by any caregiver or relative or household member, to impair or withhold emotional health, which includes acts of omissions. 6. Neglect of an adult with a developmental disability. Aggravated abuse of an elderly person is number 7. A new law requires sexual conduct by service providers. Sexual activity between a direct care service provider and a person with a developmental disability was made a crime in 2004 and is referred to in the state statute as sexual misconduct. Keep in mind that sexual misconduct is still considered a crime, even if it was first obtained from the victim. The sexual misconduct law does not follow things. Create a new crime called sexual misconduct, which is defined as sexual activity between a person provider or certain individuals with developmental disabilities. Make the crime of sexual misconduct punishable as a second-degree felony. It makes failure to report known suspected cases of misconduct as a first-degree misdemeanor. Eliminates the consent by the consumer as a valid defense. Now remember, I'm telling you that sexual misconduct does not preclude the following things. Expand the level 1 and level 2 background screening requirements, which are included to the crime of sexual misconduct as a disqualifying offense for employment. So you got to think about that, guys. When you're getting your fingerprint and background checks, you still have to adhere to all of the things, all of the requirements that we hold as a part of that background check. These are things that you cannot do. A person who witnesses a sexual misconduct or who otherwise knows of a reasonable cause to suspect that a person has engaged in sexual misconduct shall immediately report the incident of sexual abuse to the Department of Children and Families. The person shall also prepare, date, and sign an independent report that specifically describes the nature of the sexual misconduct, the location and time of the incident, and the persons involved. The person shall deliver the report to the supervisor or program director, who is responsible for providing copies to the agency's local office. Okay, we are done with our first module. That was a whole lot of information, and I'm going to be sharing some pictures with you for this module. Well, Rayfield, we're off to study zero tolerance. Make sure we have it all under our belt so that we know and we understand what is required of us as an agency for persons with disabilities, but also what is required of us as family and how we should treat each other with respect and never, ever, ever show any signs of abuse, neglect, or exploitation at Rayfield or any place else in the community ever. Module number 1 down. Let's get to module number 2.